well, it's a question most journalists have had to ask themselves at one time or another. What if this great story I'm chasing is too good to be true? That's what the New York Times and one of its marquee reporters are facing right now. Adam Riley has more, but first a warning, some of what you're about to hear is disturbing.
Rukmini Callimachi has a distinct journalistic brand. She covers extremist groups like ISIS fearlessly and with empathy.
I'm trying my best to understand these people that in many ways look like monsters to us.
Case in point, her 10-part New York Times podcast, Caliphate, which describes a young Canadian's motivations for joining ISIS and descent into violence.
I stabbed him. The blood was warm. And it sprayed everywhere.
Caliphate won a Peabody Award, but now it looks like Callimachi and the Times got played. Last week, Canadian police arrested Abu Huzaifa, whose real name is Shiroz Chowdhury, and charged him with faking his account of being a terrorist.
The RCMP now say he made it up.
For the record, Chowdhury said the same thing himself 2 years ago.
He told me I was describing what I saw. He said basically I was close enough, Andrew, to think it was actually me.
But even though her source recanted, Callimachi stood by his story.
We've been able to verify, I would say, the scaffolding of what he says.
Caliphate devoted an entire episode to holes in his account. But after she spoke with the Times' top national security reporters, Callimachi concluded the important parts held up.
He is providing details that nobody knows.
Now, that conclusion seems untenable, and Caliphate looks like a cautionary tale about getting too invested in sources and podcasts that launch before the reporting is complete.
Well, Dan Kennedy, that is exactly right what Adam just said. This idea that you don't know where you're going, but you're already you're live with a podcast, and it's progressing as the story is developing. But the most egregious part of this is the podcast where they fully vetted this character. They traced his passports. They traced his airline tickets, right down. They even tried to find out what seat he was sitting in. He spent most of the time that he said he was in Syria in Canada. They knew he was lying, and yet Callimachi said the framework or the structure of his story held up, but it didn't. Now he's under arrest.
No, it didn't. You know, in going through the transcript of that episode where they were finally trying to vet his story, it made me think of that infamous Rolling Stone investigation a number of years ago, where when the Columbia Journalism Review later reviewed what happened, you could see that the reporter, as soon as the story was published, started getting this horrible queasy feeling. Yeah. Went back to her source and said, can we talk about the lifeguard again?
This was the rape story. You should put that in context. That was that unbelievable rape story.
At the University of Virginia.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And the whole thing was a house of cards.
That's exactly what this felt like. And, you know, the other thing, too, about Callimachi, the reporter, is if you go over her history, it looks like this was kind of an inevitable development in her career. I mean, she's gotten into trouble for reporting on what turned out to be forged documents, dealing with extremely dubious sources, having some horrendous interchanges with the family of James Foley, the American journalist who was beheaded by ISIS. And this just kind of seems like the inevitable conclusion to a career that certainly has been honorable in some ways, but has also been deeply flawed.
Well, this raises a couple of interesting journalistic questions. Might be good fodder for your course, Professor Kennedy. First of all, are the standards for a New York Times podcast the same as the standards for a New York Times story? Is there a different standard to which these podcasts are held? I think back to the podcast that made podcasts go big, the Serial story about this unjustly convicted killer whose conviction, I believe, has since been reaffirmed. So, you know, I wonder about that. And then there's the broader question of, are some beats so sketchy in terms of the kind of people you're dealing with and the difficulty of, you know, how do you verify the identity and the movements of someone whose movements occurred in a country without a free press or in the shadowy underworld. That's not to say you're allowed to throw anything against the wall and see if it sticks. But I don't know Rukmini Callimachi. She's not a friend of mine, but I wonder if she shouldn't get a little more slack than someone who went out and falsified a routine police story.
That's right. And I'll give them a little bit more slack on that project, because you are right. When you're looking at investigative pieces, on whether, crime-related investigative pieces, shady characters, if you just had a high bar that I'm only going to deal with people who are open and honest and upright, you don't have a story. If you only deal with people who you are confident told you the truth 100% of the time, you probably don't have a story. So it's a very difficult balance, because you have to deal with people where you are certain there are some things that they are telling you are not true. But that one nugget that you're going for, those two nuggets that you're going for, they very well could have the answers, and so you have to go with it. So, I mean, for those who aren't involved in these kinds of stories, I know that seems a little at odds with sort of general journalism ethics, but that's kind of how it is in order for people to get at the heart of really tough stories sometimes.
But here's the problem, and I think this is the common thread with all of the problematic stories that you've mentioned so far. There's this tremendous desire, kind of need for that story to be true and for the story to go on. In the UVA case, it was this narrative that they really felt like they needed to fill about what things were like on college campuses. In the case of Caliphate, the amount of resources, investment, publicity that had gone into this, that someone in one of the stories, the news stories written about this situation, someone said that the reporter was too big to fail. And to some degree, the whole project felt too big to fail. They did go through that sort of vetting process and they concluded, well, it is, might not pass the court of law, might not even meet journalistic standards, but Occam's razor seems like it could be true, and they just went with it. And they wanted it to be true.